Welcome to the Deep Dive. This time, we're tackling a pretty big topic, corruption, a whole book on it. And knowing you're interested in power dynamics, especially when it comes to men's rights issues, this is going to be really eye-opening.
Yeah, definitely.
We're digging into this book called Simply Corruption, and it takes us through history, from ancient Rome all the way to modern scandals. And we're going to see how institutions, from governments to religious groups, even business, how they become susceptible to corruption.
You know, one of the things that really stands out in this book is how it emphasizes that corruption is not just about a few bad actors. It's really about the systems and the incentives that create these opportunities for exploit. Think of it like this. Even seemingly good actions or institutions, they can have hidden agenda, unintended consequences.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think that really resonates with a lot of the concerns that are raised in the men's rights community, especially when we talk about covert contracts, these agreements where things are not clearly stated, which leads to imbalances and potential exploitation.
Yeah, and the book actually touches on this through different historical examples. For example, the Balfour Declaration of 1917. On the surface, it promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
Right.
But when the author digs a little deeper, it reveals this whole web of complex political motivations, hidden agreements.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, what are the real intentions behind, seemingly good actions?
Right.
And it makes me think about discussions we see in the Red Pill community about really recognizing and addressing unspoken expectations in relationships, these covert contracts that can lead to, down the line, resentment, conflict.
Absolutely. It encourages you to really think critically about how these power dynamics play out, not just in, big historical events, but in our personal lives as well.
For sure.
And speaking of power dynamics, the book delves into some really fascinating examples of how religious authority has been misused throughout history.
Oh, wow.
The Crusades, for example.
Yeah.
It started as a religious expedition.
Right.
Quickly devolved into these brutal campaigns that were fueled by greed and power.
It's a stark reminder that, any institution, even one that claims to have, this moral high ground, can be corrupt.
Yeah, for sure.
It makes me think about discussions about the capture of institutions by certain ideologies, something that the men's rights movement often talks about in relation to feminism and its influence on, say, family courts and social structure.
Right.
How these things, they happen gradually. It seems like small compromises over time, but eventually it shifts the power balance and the purpose of that institution.
Exactly, yeah. And the East India Company, that's a perfect example of how economic institutions can become corrupted. I mean, they were notorious for using bribes and political manipulation just to gain control of markets and crush their competition.
A classic case of using money and influence to manipulate the systems for their own personal gain at the expense of everyone else.
Exactly.
It reminds me of the concerns that some people have in the men's rights community about how certain industries or ideologies benefit from maybe perpetuating gender stereotypes or keeping the power structures that we have in place.
Yeah. Really interesting connection.
Yeah.
And this book, it really encourages you to examine those systems and really ask yourself who benefits from the way things are set up right now.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, let's move on to something that I think will really resonate with you, and that's financial corruption.
Yeah, this is something that, I think affects everyone. But sometimes it feels like the deck is stacked against the average person.
Right.
The book starts by breaking down Ponzi schemes, using Charles Ponzi, the original schemer, and then also Bernie Madoff, who orchestrated like the largest Ponzi scheme in history, to show how these scams work and how bad the impact they can have.
Right.
For those who maybe aren't familiar, can you just break down how a Ponzi scheme actually works? Because I think even understanding how that works can help us be more discerning in other areas of life too.
Yeah. Imagine there's this charismatic person. They're promising these really high returns on your investment.
Right.
They might even deliver. Initially, they use money from new investors to pay off the old ones.
Wow.
So it creates this illusion of success, attracts even more people.
Right.
But it's all a facade.
Yeah.
There's no real investment going on. It's just this redistribution of money. And eventually the whole thing falls apart.
Right, like a house of cards.
Yeah, exactly.
Built on deception and manipulation. This idea that they use charisma and promises to take advantage of people really connects, I think, to that red pill philosophy of being aware of these manipulation tactics.
For sure. And the book argues that by understanding these financial scams, we become more aware of manipulative tactics in other areas of life.
Totally.
Relationships, politics. And speaking of manipulation, the Enron scandal is a perfect example of how these accounting tricks and corporate greed can lead to disaster.
Yeah, Enron, and this is a huge energy company,
Yeah.
and it all came crashing down when their practices were exposed.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about Enron, and it ties back to the covert contract idea, is they created these unspoken agreements with their employees.
Right.
Promised them wealth and success,
Yeah.
but never really put it in writing.
Yeah.
And when everything collapsed, those employees were left with nothing.
Really powerful example of how unspoken expectations and agreements can be used to exploit people.
Yeah.
And the book argues this happens not just in finance, but in a lot of areas of life. Personal relationships, where these covert contracts can lead to resentment.
So always be aware of the dynamics, right? Question motives behind the promise and make sure that those agreements, whether it's business or personal, are clear and beneficial to everyone involved.
Exactly. Speaking of systems that seem rigged against us, the book talks about the savings and loan crisis in the 80s and 90s. Over 1,000 institutions collapsed, costing taxpayers billions of dollars. It was a combination of deregulation, risky lending, and just straight up fraud.
Yeah, so a prime example of how, institutional corruption can have a ripple effect throughout the entire economy.
Yeah.
It impacts people's livelihoods and their financial security, and it really makes you question, who are these systems actually serving?
Yeah, it's a really important question the book encourages us to ask.
Yeah.
And it goes on to examine the subprime mortgage crisis of 2007-2008, where these risky mortgage lending practices just fueled a complete meltdown that impacted the entire global economy.
And all of these crises, while complex, they often stem from a lack of transparency and accountability. And those at the top benefit, while, again, the average person suffers the consequences.
Exactly. And the book delves into the LIBOR manipulation scandal of 2012. This is where these major banks, UBS and Barclays, manipulated a key interest rate just for profit. Shows how even those technical aspects of finance can be manipulated for personal gain.
Yeah, eroding trust in those institutions. It's a reminder to be vigilant, to question the systems that govern our lives, and demand that transparency and accountability from those who have the power.
For sure.
And I think that message resonates with that men's rights movements focus on challenging those power structures and advocating for fairness and equality.
Yeah, absolutely. This book really encourages you to think critically about power, who benefits from the current way things are, and how we can create more just and equitable systems.
Yeah, and that's just the beginning. We've just scratched the surface of this book and its exploration of corruption. There's so much more to uncover.
Absolutely. One area the book really shines a light on is political corruption. And, I think you'll find the nuances here particularly relevant to your interests.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we often hear about bribery and embezzlement, which obviously those are really harmful. But the book goes deeper into these more subtle forms of political corruption that can be just as damaging.
Yeah, like nepotism, for instance. That's that age-old practice of favoring family and friends, regardless of, whether they deserve the position or the benefits or not. And the book shows how this has been a problem throughout history. Creating these systems where connections matter more than your actual qualifications.
It really makes you think about all the discussions we have in the men's rights community about fairness and meritocracy. It's almost like that feeling that the system is rigged against you if you don't have the right connections.
Yeah.
And this book seems to confirm that, showing how this is a recurring theme across time and different cultures.
It makes you realize this isn't a new thing. It's been woven into power structures forever.
Yeah, and the book also dives into this complex world of lobbying, which is often presented as like this necessary part of the democratic process. But the author really exposes how corporate interests can use lobbying to really influence policy.
Right.
In a way that benefits them and not the public good.
The book uses the opioid crisis as a chilling example. Pharmaceutical companies spending millions on lobbying efforts just to ensure the flow of these highly addictive painkillers, downplaying the risks, putting profits over public health.
Yeah, that's a prime example of how that corporate influence can really have these unintended consequences.
Yeah, and it ties into this whole idea of institutional capture,
Right.
where powerful industries or interest groups, they basically can hijack these institutions, use their resources to shape regulations and policies benefiting them, not the people.
And that resonates with that red pill idea of being aware of those hidden agendas and influence, especially within institutions that we are told to trust. It encourages you to think who is really pulling the string.
Exactly. Yeah. And speaking of influence, the book also tackles campaign finance, especially in the wake of the Citizens United decision, which basically opened the floodgates for money to influence politics.
I remember that. There were a lot of concerns about whether our politicians were actually representing the people or just representing those special interests who are funding their campaigns.
And the book presents a pretty compelling argument that this influx of money really distorts the political process, creating this system where access and influence are basically up for sale.
Yeah, it's enough to make you cynical about the whole system.
Yeah.
But, the book doesn't just dwell on problems. It explores corruption within institutions that we associate with morality and ethics, like religious organizations.
Yeah, for sure. The book actually goes back and talks about the Crusades. framing them not just as a religious expedition, but also as a power grab fueled by greed and violence. It's a reminder that even institutions claiming moral authority can be corrupt.
And it makes you think about those concerns within the men's rights movement, about institutions that get co-opted for ideological purposes.
Right.
It just shows how this can happen gradually, with small compromises over time that lead to a complete shift in what that institution was originally supposed to be about.
Yeah, exactly. And the book doesn't shy away from looking at modern examples either. It discusses ISIS and how they twisted religious rhetoric to justify their brutality. It shows how these extremist ideologies can exploit faith to do bad things.
It's a reminder to always be critical of any ideology that tries to silence dissent or justify violence.
Yeah.
Especially, in the name of a higher purpose.
Yeah, for sure. And the book also touches upon those televangelist scandals, like the Jim Baker scandal. It's just an example of how financial corruption and hypocrisy can seep into even those seemingly pious institutions.
Right. Like, we shouldn't blindly trust any institution or leader, no matter what they say about their own morality.
Absolutely. And speaking of institutions that demand scrutiny, the book dives deep into the Catholic Church abuse scandal. It's just this heartbreaking example of how power can be used to protect those who do wrong and silence the victim.
That was a scandal that really shook a lot of people's faith in the church. It revealed how that institutional power can be used to just cover up bad things.
It's a stark reminder that even institutions that are supposed to be providing spiritual guidance and support, they can be corrupted by those seeking to protect their own interests.
It makes you realize how important it is to demand that transparency and accountability from all institutions, no matter how moral we think they are.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole theme of abusive power, it becomes really apparent when we start talking about corruption in law enforcement.
Yeah. And it's a topic that is constantly, in the news, especially with all the conversations we're having about police brutality and accountability.
The book tackles this head on, drawing parallels between historical examples of police corruption, like the Knapp Commission investigation into the NYPD back in the 70s, and the concerns we have today.
It's really interesting to see how these patterns just repeat themselves over time. Like the Knapp Commission, they uncovered all this bribery, extortion, drug dealing within the NYPD.
It was a huge scandal. They tried to make reforms, but it just showed how deep that corruption can be within law enforcement.
And the book doesn't shy away from discussing those high-profile cases like Rodney King, Michael Brown, George Floyd, all these tragedies that sparked outrage and calls for reform.
Those cases really highlighted the consequences of those power imbalances in law enforcement, and they just emphasized how much we need more accountability.
And the book looks at the different mechanisms that are in place to try and increase police accountability. Like internal affairs divisions, civilian review boards, and body cameras.
But it also acknowledges that those have their limitations.
Right.
And emphasizes that we really need some systemic change
Right.
to address the root cause of corruption and abuse of power in law enforcement.
It's a complex issue. There are no easy answers.
The book really encourages us to think critically about what police reform should look like. What would a just and accountable law enforcement system actually be?
And it's important to remember that it's not just about individual officers. It's about the system that often protects them. Makes it hard to hold them accountable.
Absolutely, yeah. And, that resonates with a lot of concerns we hear from the men's rights movement, especially when we talk about those perceived biases in the legal system and lack of accountability for those who perpetuate them.
It's a reminder that we need to be vigilant in demanding transparency and justice, not just from those individual officers, but from the whole system.
Yeah, for sure. Another area where corruption can have these serious consequences is the military. It's often overlooked, but the book really sheds some light on the potential for abuse.
Yeah, we often think of the military as this, bastion of honor and integrity, but the book reveals that even it can be corrupted by power and greed.
Starts off discussing the F-22 Raptor scandal. It was just mismanagement and waste within the military-industrial complex.
Wow, overcharging for fighter jets, bribes, fraudulent practice. That one really showed how greed can seep into even the defense industry.
Yeah, and the book also cites this report by the Government Accountability Office. They found all these significant financial losses due to corruption in the Afghan war. It raises questions about how our taxpayer dollars are being used.
It's concerning to think that corruption can happen in the very institutions that are supposed to be protecting our country.
Absolutely. And the book also explores how favoritism and nepotism can distort military promotion, undermining the idea that you should be promoted based on your merits. And that can compromise how effective our armed forces are.
Right, and that kind of goes back to that theme of fairness and equality.
Right.
That resonates so much with the men's rights movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of secrecy and agendas, the book talks about the Iran-Contra affair. This whole thing involved covert operations, disregard for the law,
It's a reminder that even in matters of national security, corruption can happen when we don't have transparency and accountability.
Exact. Speaking of manipulating information, let's move on to the media.
Right. I mean, in today's world, we're bombarded with information from all sides. It's more important than ever to be media literate and be able to tell fact from fiction.
Yeah, for sure. And the book starts by discussing these propaganda techniques, how they can be used to manipulate what we think.
Right.
You know, it's not always these outright lies.
Yeah.
It's about framing information in a certain way, leaving out certain facts, or just appealing to people's emotions rather than logic.
It's amazing how easily we can be swayed by those techniques, especially when they play on our fears and prejudices.
Yeah, and the book connects this to the modern day problem of fake news. It's
Yeah.
just become so prevalent in the age of social media.
Social media has made it so easy for false information to spread quickly. That can have some pretty devastating consequences.
Yeah, the book goes into how fake news is created, how it spreads, and how it's used to influence things like election. It makes you realize we can't just passively consume information.
Right.
We need to think critically, check what we read,
Yeah.
always be on the lookout for those attempts to manipulate.
And the book gives some good tips on how to spot fake news and how to be, more discerning consumers of information. Seek out different perspectives.
Right.
Be wary of information that just confirms your existing bias.
Exactly. Yeah. It's so important in a world where algorithms often create these echo chambers.
Right.
Just feeding us information that reinforces what we already believe.
And then the book also goes into those different forms of censorship, government restrictions on what we can say to corporations controlling media content.
Yeah, censorship can take so many forms. And it's not always as obvious as banning books or movies. It can be more subtle, like self-censorship, or algorithms that suppress certain viewpoints. The book uses historical examples to show how censorship has been used to silence people who challenge those in power.
It makes you realize that our freedom of speech is something that we really need to protect.
Right.
It's in a constant threat.
Yeah, and the book brings it into the modern day, exploring how governments and corporations are using new technology to monitor and control how information flows.
It's a bit unsettling to think about all that tracking going on and the potential for censorship.
It discusses how social media shapes the conversations we have, and how we can balance that freedom of speech with the need to combat hate speech and misinformation.
That's a tough one to solve.
Yeah, it's really complex. But the book emphasizes how important it is to fight for our right to free speech, both online and offline.
Because that's what a healthy democracy needs, that freedom to express ourselves.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's dive into a specific case study that the book uses to show just how dangerous censorship can be. The case of Rupert Murdoch and Fox News.
Fox News has been a controversial media outlet for years, often accused of presenting a biased and potentially misleading view of things.
And the book explores how Rupert Murdoch, who's this media mogul, has used Fox News to push his own agenda and influence how people think.
It's a reminder that media ownership matters, and we need to be critical thinkers, especially when we get information from sources that clearly have an agenda.
Right, yeah. The book talks about how Fox News has blurred the lines between news and opinion, using inflammatory language and selective reporting just to appeal to a specific audience.
That's something a lot of media outlets do.
Yeah, but Fox News has taken it to a whole new level.
Right.
And the book really explores the impact that this has had on our political conversations,
Yeah.
arguing that it's contributed to this polarization and a decline in trust in our traditional media.
Yeah, it's a good reminder of just how powerful the media can be in shaping how we see the world.
Yeah, it highlights how important media literacy is,
Yeah.
and just thinking critically to navigate this really complex world of media.
Yeah. Okay, so let's switch gears for a second and talk about another topic that often comes up when we talk about globalization, the link between corruption and poverty.
Yeah, corruption is a huge obstacle to development, and it hits the poorest and most vulnerable the hardest.
And the book uses countries like Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo as examples of how widespread corruption can drain resources away from public services, and it just hinders economic growth.
It's like a vicious cycle.
Right.
Poverty creates the conditions for corruption to thrive, and then that corruption just keeps people trapped in poverty.
Its heartbreak really highlights how important it is to address corruption if we want to reduce poverty.
Yeah. And the book explores how corruption can take many different forms. From small-scale bribery to large-scale corruption involving high-ranking officials.
It really shows that it's not just about a few bad apples. It's often a systemic problem that's deeply embedded in institutions and cultural norms.
Yeah, and it talks about how corruption undermines democracy,
Yeah.
erodes that trust we have in our government, and just creates a sense of lawlessness,
Yeah.
where those in power can do whatever they want without any consequence.
Yeah, it's really disheartening to see how that can hinder a country's progress and keep people trapped in poverty.
And the book emphasizes that it's not just about punishing those individuals, it's about creating these systems that are transparent, accountable, empowering citizens, and really promoting a culture of integrity.
And the book also explores the connection between corruption and terrorism, which isn't something we automatically think about. But it makes sense when you consider how corruption can destabilize societies, creating those opportunities for these extremist groups.
Right, because corruption weakens those government institutions, erodes public trust, creates a climate of lawlessness, and that can create a vacuum for terrorist groups to exploit. The book uses the example of ISIS in Iraq. They were able to capitalize on the corruption in the Iraqi government and military to gain a foothold.
It's a reminder that corruption can have these really far-reaching consequences. It's not just about those individual acts of bribery or whatever. It's creating conditions where societies become more vulnerable.
Exactly. And the book also explores how corruption can make it easier to finance terrorism, providing those channels for these illicit funds and making it harder to track and disrupt. It highlights how we need to tackle corruption if we want to fight terrorism effectively.
So after exploring all these different aspects of corruption, what does the book offer as solution? I mean, it's one thing to diagnose the problem, but what can we actually do about it?
Well, the book doesn't just leave you with a feeling of hopelessness. It offers a bunch of strategies for fighting back, starting with the role of non-governmental organizations, NGOs.
Yeah. NGOs have been instrumental in raising awareness about corruption, pushing for reforms, and empowering citizens.
Right, like Transparency International. They've been at the forefront of the global fight against corruption for years.
I've heard of them.
They developed tools like the Corruption Perceptions Index. It ranks countries based on how corrupt they're perceived to be. And it's really powerful for holding governments accountable and tracking progress.
Yeah, because it's one thing to talk about corruption in general, but having those concrete numbers, being able to compare countries, that's really helpful.
Absolutely. And beyond that global level, NGOs also work on the ground, empowering communities, educating people about corruption, and supporting local initiatives.
So it's not just about top-down solutions, it's also about a grassroots effort.
You got it. And the book also explores the role of technology.
Oh, interesting.
Things like blockchain and data analytics can be used to promote transparency, track transactions, and identify corruption.
I've heard a lot about blockchain, how it could change things. How does the book see it being used in this fight?
Well, blockchain creates this permanent tamper-proof record of transactions,
Okay.
making it much harder for corrupt people to hide their activities.
Sounds like that could be a game changer for transparency and accountability.
Exactly. And the book talks about how it's already being used in different areas, like supply chains and voting systems. It could really change how we think about trust and accountability.
What about data analytics? How can that help fight corruption?
Data analytics is all about analyzing these huge data sets to find patterns and anomalies. So in this context, you can use it to spot suspicious transactions, follow the flow of money, or see where corruption is really bad.
So it gives you a bigger picture view.
Exactly. And the book even talks about how artificial intelligence can make data analytics even more powerful.
That's really fascinating. It's encouraging to see how we can use technology to fight this age-old problem.
Yeah, it definitely gives us some hope. But the book reminds us that technology is just a tool. At the end of the day, fighting corruption requires changing our mindset, being committed to doing what's right, and holding people accountable.
Right. Technology can help expose corruption, but it's up to us to create a culture where it's not tolerated.
Absolutely. And speaking of accountability, the book talks a lot about whistleblowers.
Yeah. Whistleblowers are those brave individuals who speak out against wrongdoing, even when it's risky.
Right. They play a crucial role in exposing corruption.
They do. And the book stresses how important it is to protect them, because they often face retaliation and challenges for speaking out.
Absolutely. We need to create systems where they are supported, not punished.
And we need to make it clear that speaking out against corruption is a good thing.
Exactly. And we can't forget the role of the media in all of this.
Yeah, free and independent press is so important for a democracy. And journalists who are willing to dig deep and report on corruption, they help keep those in power in check.
Absolutely. It sounds like this fight requires everyone to be involved.
Yeah, governments, organizations, the media, individuals, we all have a part to play.
And the book ends by reminding us that ultimately it comes down to each of us.
We can't just wait for someone else to solve the problem.
Exactly. We need to be informed, engaged citizens who are willing to speak out, support anti-corruption efforts, and demand better from our leader.
It's a powerful message. This has been a really insightful deep dive into corruption. It's obviously a huge and complex issue, but it's not impossible to tackle. By understanding it, recognizing its many forms, and taking action, we can all contribute to creating a world where integrity and accountability are the norm.
And if you want to learn more about this fascinating and important topic, You can find Corruption on Amazon, Kindle, and Google Playbooks. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand how the world really works.